did community development, and graduated
last November.
Okay.
Yeah, last November.
So he came to work with us as an RA through the big program. He did a MyTax internship, which is what this work comes out of, which is a paid $15,000 internship. And he was partnered with Tourism Victoria, and they had a need for this research, so Alex did it and got paid, and then subsequently has presented it at different conferences. A chapter is submitted to a special issue that we're doing. So he's been very busy around the pre-clearance topic. This is his swan song with Big, because tomorrow is his last day. He is moving on to a job in the provincial government. But he's been with us. We've been working together for about 2 years now.
Over two and a half years.
2.5 years.
Maybe more.
Time flies. So, anyways, Alex is kind of the success story of students coming out of the MA program who work with us, get lots of opportunity to publish and do research, and then move on to brighter pastures. Yeah.
All the CD.
So over to you, Alex. I'll cut you off if you take too much time.
Okay, thank you. I hope I can keep you all entertained. Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming. This, as Nicole said, this came out of a MyTax internship, and the initial research was done with Tourism Victoria with the economic benefits. It was basically a cost-benefit analysis of pre-clearance, and that was in mind for the southern Vancouver Island. Then that's kind of the first phase of this project. The second phase came earlier on this year, where I began actual big research study into more looking at pre-clearance from a more critical lens. So I will kind of alternate between the two phases of the program as I go through, and I've kind of the big study now has incorporated both. So the actual paper that I put up on the website and everything has both of those in it. A smaller version of the first phase has been incorporated into the larger study. So you'll see elements of both as I go through. So to start off, I kind of wanted to put it within the borders and globalization context. This project is a practical case study into how border management is evolving in the 21st century. Basically, how border policies are changing and originating far from the borderline. We're looking at a displacement of the border. In a way, border policies are becoming aterritorial, and we'll talk about that more later. And I wanted to start off with this quote from the CBP Port Director. So that CBP is Customs and Border Protection, the U.S. Port Director stationed here in Victoria, who in one of my interviews, he said, the more that we can push our borders out, the better we like it. So I think that's a really good, it's very illustrative of the way, some borders are being pushed out and actually are crossing over into other sovereign territories. So start off with terminology, pre-clearance versus pre-inspection. So pre-clearance is a process in which customs, immigration, and other border functions of a foreign country are undertaken within a host country. And that is different from pre-inspection, where officers determine the identity and nationality of each traveler and prevent the entry of ineligible passengers. So basically, as pre-inspection, they basically deem you admissible or inadmissible, but then all the other customs procedures happen on the other side. So pre-inspection, you'll see, happens here in southern Vancouver Island at the ferry services. So in Belleville Terminal, when you're going to Port Angeles, you go through pre-inspection on this side, and then you go through pre-clearance. Sorry, you get cleared on the other side. So you are stopping on the other side. So the Port Angeles ones that goes to Port Angeles. Sorry. That goes from Belleville to Port Angeles and then to Seattle through the Clipper, as well as the Ana Cortez ferry that leaves from Sydney Ferry Terminal. Both of those do a pre-inspection. So pre-clearance, I should say first, that these operations have been in place at airports across Canada since the 1970s, and only recently have we begun to discuss extending that to land, rail, and marine border crossings. So pre-clearance isn't new, but the way that we're extending it is a new thing. The journey to expanded pre-clearance, it really began after the events of September 11th, and there was a push towards heightened border security. The 2001 Smart Border Declaration sought to securitize the U.S.-Canada border through a combination of pre-existing processes, and especially new technologies, so biometric identification is one of them, and the establishment of border security agencies such as Canada Border Services and integrated border enforcement teams, which are collaboration between U.S. and Canadian border enforcement officers who work on both sides of the border. Between that and then Beyond the Border Action Plan, we started the FAST program, the Free and Secure Trade program, which allows basically truck drivers or other shippers to cross easily and efficiently, to be signed up basically ahead of time so that they can cross over to the border very, very easily, kind of almost seamlessly, as well as the Nexus program, which is like the FAST program but for travelers. So individual travelers sign up for it, and they're basically deemed eligible or ineligible based on their past activities, based on their behavior, and this kind of thing. So Nexus travelers are able to pass back and forth across the U.S.-Canada border fairly straightforward, very easily. And then the Beyond the Border Action Plan happened. This is a long-term partnership which seeks to augment collective security and accelerate the flow of legitimate goods, services, and people both at and beyond the border. And so preclearance is a part of the Beyond the Border Action Plan, or at least the expansion of preclearance is a part of that. So the Land, Rail, Marine, and Air Transport Preclearance Agreement, LRMA, was a part of the Beyond the Border Action Plan, signed in March 2015, and actually just received royal assent almost a year ago. And it's basically a reciprocal agreement. So it commits both countries to establishing preclearance for land, rail, and sea travelers on both sides of the border, similar to air travel, similar to the way it's established already in airports across Canada. This basically, by reciprocal, it means that where U.S. officers are placed on our side, then on the Canadian side, then Canadian Border Services agents can also be placed on the American side, although that hasn't happened yet. And then as for tourism and for streamlining travel, preclearance is an opportunity for this, creating better travel experiences and reputations for destinations. And that's the Tourism Victoria piece too. That this part of the project was kind of the first phase, I guess, was really geared towards that. Does it create better travel experience? Is it better for destinations to have preclearance? So I wanted to kind of give an outline of why this is happening and how this kind of came about. Like why are we looking at preclearance across U.S. Canada? It's a pretty unique situation. Other than in the European Union, this preclearance here is actually pretty unique. We have a shared cultural, ideological, and political values along the U.S.-Canadian border, at least historically, and particularly here in Cascadia bioregion. As Michael Hart, one of the authors of one of the pieces that was accompanying this seminar, he noted that the U.S. and Canada have enjoyed what he calls a culture of trust and collaboration, which has led to policy convergence as well as policy parallelism and closer cross-border integration on issues regarding regional policy and governance, as well as heightened cross-border communication and dialectic between regions. And another author, Susan Clark, has talked about Cascadia quite a bit, and she has noted that there's a coherent, multi-state and binational policy community active on regional transportation issues, and transportation initiatives are framed as regional solutions to economic competition concerns. So preclearance kind of was born out of this relationship. It's a special relationship, especially here in Cascadia, in the Pacific Northwest. So I'll start off with this is again phase one of the project was actual research, on the ground research with participants from both municipal agencies as well as federal agencies. So on the left side are a lot of private tour operators, as well as the Pacific Northwest Economic Region. And then on the right side are more of the federal agencies, as well as U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So I interviewed representatives from each of these organizations to ask them what their thoughts were on preclearance and what it might look like on the ground. So the findings were, for this particular project, were as we could expect. They aligned with the City of Victoria's long-term strategy. They're part of the city's economic action plan. The provincial BC government fully supports expanded preclearance in the region, and the BC government has been working closely with the Victoria Mayor's office to advocate for multimodal preclearance at Victoria's ports. In addition to federal support, the US CBP is fully on board, and they've deemed it financially, logistically, and politically beneficial. And this isn't surprising, because preclearance has been in the research that and the anticipated economic benefits. They all are very positive, and they're all expected. Preclearance is expected to bring a lot of capital to the city and to local businesses. So this was kind of this isn't surprising. So I just want to kind of give an overview of what we're talking about for this particular phase, this case study. I don't know how familiar you guys are with downtown, but this is the downtown, and then just above James Bay, you'll see the Inner Harbor. And so that's where the ferry, the Belleville Ferry Terminal is situated, which goes to Port Angeles, and the Clipper is also housed there, which goes down to Seattle. And then just down on the bottom, there's what's called Augen Point ship terminal, cruise ship terminal. So it's for cruise ships coming through. And the proximity is important too, because when we talk about later on, I'll talk about co-location and sharing of resources. Having facilities that are close to each other is also a big plus. So first, we'll talk about Belleville Ferry Terminal. People I spoke to with Belleville, who worked at Belleville, said that they're prepared to shift from pre-inspection to full preclearance, and they have already began a redevelopment to accommodate shared CBSA and US CBP facilities. So with co-location, it means these two agencies operating under one roof, sharing the same facilities, same resources, and actually being side by side, working together to pre-clear travelers. The other area is Augen Point, which is a cruise ship, a deep water port facility. It's a port of call for cruise ships, and they carry up to 3,000 passengers each. Right now, it's a port of call, so it means it doesn't start and end in Victoria. It travels through Victoria. So passengers are basically on the cruise ship before it arrives. They get off for, let's say, a day, get back on again, and go and continue on. If preclearance was to be instituted at this or established at this facility, that would mean that passengers can start and end their journeys in Victoria, which is an incredible boost to the local economy. One of the interviews said that a shift to what they call a home porting, so having the ship start and end there, would make a gain of from 400,000 Canadian dollars for any turnaround day, 400,000, up to $2 million. So that's what they're looking at, and that's why there's this massive push to make this happen. So right now they are only in the initial planning stages of this going forward, but we can expect that in the future we'll see that happen. So we can talk about the pros and cons of that for sure. So the challenges that the interviewees raised were that the design standards have yet to be approved by stakeholders in Canada and the U.S. And this is really this kind of speaks to the collaboration element that is needed. If we want to go forward with this, there's no one design fits all for preclearance sites. Every site is going to have to be signed off by both Canada and the U.S. and they're all going to have to make sure that they agree with what's being put forward. The picture there is of the Belleville Ferry Terminal, and some of you may know that place. But I mean, as you can see, it looks like it's kind of pretty run down in a way, mesh walling and stuff like that. So it's kind of ripe for redevelopment, and I think that's what they're aiming for. That's why I feel like that's why they've kept it like that. Is like just because they're ready to switch it up as soon as possible. Also, there's a lack of statistical data because this is a new era, I guess, of preclearance. There's not so much proven data on if it's going to be if it indeed is going to be economic, if it's going to bring economic benefits to the area, if it will speed up travel. We just don't know for sure. There could be a chance of slowing down travel just because people are maybe there's more scrutiny at on one side than the other. So there is that risk. And then the other concerns are social, political, and environmental, which the interviewees never raised in the first phase of this program because they were all very focused on the actual gain, the economic gain for it. So the socio-political concerns that have been raised by other members of the government as well as private citizens, they weren't even brought up. And those concerns basically are one of the primary concerns is how much power the U.S. CBP officers are going to be given, seeing as they're working on Canadian soil. What is their sphere of influence, basically, on Canadian soil, and that's where Borders and Globalization in that context kind of gets really interesting because we're talking about people, officers, agencies from another country trying to, or not trying to, but basically working and doing their basically doing their thing on another state's soil. So it gets really interesting. The recommendations that I came out with for the first phase of this project were that the U.S. and Canada need to increase collaborative efforts, or all stakeholders in preclearance need to increase collaborative efforts to formulate appropriate technical design standards. Then identify options for shared CBSA and US CBP facilities. So this is where co-location is brought up. So co-location means basically placement of both agencies in a single facility under one roof. Establishing bilateral, uniform monitoring and evaluation frameworks. That will be particularly important within the first few years of this agreement going forward, because they'll need to have up-to-date records of what's been happening and whether or not it's actually improved traveling. And then ensuring the preclearance operations advance the goals set out in the Beyond the Border Action Plan. And that's basically speaking to the reciprocal nature of the agreement. So right now, CBSA officials in Canada are researching ways in which they can be situated on the American side, but they have yet to find their first kind of pilot facility because the traffic flows more one way than the other, more from Canada down to the U.S. Whether or not it's feasible to house CBSA officials on the U.S. side is a question that they need to answer. So that brings us to the next kind of, I guess, phase of this project, which was more looking at preclearance from a critical lens. So I wouldn't say all, but most of the articles that I ran up, that I kind of found in my literature reviews spoke to the economic gains that are involved. Few of them spoke to what this means for state sovereignty, for example. There are a few, but because preclearance, and especially expanded preclearance, is so new, there was very little to go on in that sense. So this feels like it's a really kind of a new area to study, which is really cool. So there are the two big Borders and Globalization hypotheses, and where this fits into them. The first hypothesis we have is that border state policies tend to straddle their sovereign boundary lines, and that networked policies overlap many different jurisdictional scales, including but not exclusively that of the sovereign territories of states. Borders tend to be resituated now at sources of movement. And with preclearance, we can see how this is an example of that, with the border being situated at the source of movement of passengers, as well as goods, which I'm not talking about now, goods and services, but we're sticking with passenger preclearance, but goods and services are also, they're also part of this wider agreement. The second big hypothesis is that bordering processes are increasingly not territorial anymore, but fundamentally linked to movements across the world. We found that bordering policies increasingly disregard the territorial limits of states, sometimes implementing borders thousands of kilometers away from their international boundary line. And so this is another example of policies. Preclearance is an example of policies actually being established far from the boundary line. Where we are in southern Vancouver Island, we're not that far from the boundary line, but you can see how this can happen in somewhere in the middle of the States and pre-clearing people halfway across the world. This is something that so when we say aterritorial, this is something that this is an example of that. And aterritorial, I'd like to when I end, I'd like to go back to that because I think it's worth talking about what we mean by when we say aterritorial. It's something that I've also kind of continually wondered and continually questioned throughout my time with BIG, and so I think it'd be interesting to get a conversation going about that. Because preclearance activities seek to carry out bordering processes in spaces that are physically removed from the boundary line, they are illustrative of policy that diffuses the border and its functions. Through these activities, the border becomes both securitized and streamlined. That's kind of a reference. My title of this is a reference to that. Is that the border is both securitized by becoming more and more, more technologies are being put towards us, more resources are being put toward identifying threats. But then they're also becoming more streamlined because travel is anticipated to become easier and more seamless. So it's an interesting dichotomy there. And the terms that have been used by other people has been that the border becomes thickened and also thinned at the same time, which I thought was an interesting way to see it. And this quote from Hiller is interesting. Bordering is a process more than it is a fixed line. So the concept of sharing of sovereignty comes up in these discussions. One of the articles that was accompanied this seminar was by Harry Hiller, who talks about airport preclearance. And one of his quotes was pretty good. He said, while U.S. preclearance officers apply American laws and regulations to immigration, customs, public health and safety, and agricultural operations, these officials must also abide by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Canadian Bill of Rights, as well as the Canadian Human Rights Act. So this speaks to the concerns that some people had with preclearance in that it would allow U.S. CBP officers to have too much authority or too much power, and what was the actual sphere of influence. Well, right here we can see that that's where it ends, or that's where the division is that they do have their own American laws do go on Canadian soil, but they stop when it comes to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Bill of Rights, and the Human Rights Act. So, for example, if an American border, if a U.S. CBP official wants to frisk search you, for example, they need to first inform a Canadian official. So the Canadian official has to come and basically deems whether or not it's necessary. And if it is, then the Canadian official will do the frisk search. American border guards, U.S. CBP officials stationed on Canadian soil aren't allowed to carry firearms because Canadian officials don't. So that's the kind of thing that preclearance, where the division is. And also this idea of security. Sorry. Before I go there, I also want to bring up the concept of what has been called sovereignty bargains. So again, with sovereignty, the question of sovereignty, this came up in one of the articles by Acklison, and he mentions that sovereignty bargains are agreements whereby states voluntarily accept some limitations in exchange for certain benefits. So, for instance, the U.S. may move toward harmonizing certain policies with Canada in exchange for more efficiency in the cross-border movement of southbound goods or people. In this way, sovereignty bargaining may help to induce policy convergence at the border. So it's just an idea I wanted to share with you, because I thought that was pretty interesting, is that what kind of bargains can countries make especially in this kind of in this kind of agreement, what are the bargains that you can make, and where do you make your concessions, and where do you hold firm on other things, and what kind of bargains is Canada willing to make to allow preclearance to happen in the U.S., and how far can that go? So that's an interesting question. The second point I have up here is the security first, efficiency second, and or vice versa. So in my discussions with Canadian agencies, they usually the discussions kind of usually veered toward the fostering of collaboration with U.S. counterparts and the financial gains related to more predictable and efficient cross-border travel and trade, rather than concern for threat identification. And some scholars have argued that Canadian border issues primarily belong to the economic policy sphere, whereas U.S. border functions are at their core concerned with security. So if we go with that, so from the U.S. standpoint, preclearance is security first, efficiency second, whereas from the Canadian standpoint, it could be argued that Canada is more efficiency first, economic gains first, security second, and that's a really interesting thing to think about, because when we're looking at how we're setting up these facilities, what is the priority? What are we looking at as the priority? Is it security? Or is it the economy? And so that's a really interesting thing. We can discuss that later as well. So almost done. This is just I want to point to this as the kind of future of preclearance and what we're looking at as we go forward. Right now, individuals are screened, biometrics are gathered, and traveler behavior is monitored closely. And technology at the border is allowing an increasingly vast amount of information to be stored, shared, and distributed across borders. So what that means for us, how do we go forward, knowing that all this information, for a long time it has been shared, but now we're able to get it to, or at least the officials are able to get it earlier, faster, and it doesn't leave much to. It kind of allows them to focus more on behavior as opposed to actual administrative processes. So I think that's really interesting. One of the big things that came up too recently is mobile passport control. Has anybody heard about the mobile passport control app that you can get? So on the right, that square is the app logo, and it's actually an app that allows you to fill in customs declaration cards on your phone before you get to the customs official. So usually they'll hand out those customs declarations, but this allows you to do it ahead of time. It allows you to scan your passport. It allows you to take a picture of yourself and have all that in your phone. And so when you go to the border official, you can just scan it, and then they ask you a couple of questions, and you continue on. So this is something it's amazing that it's happening. I actually downloaded it on my phone just like a few days ago, and I looked through it, and it actually is really cool because you can actually just do everything you want on your phone, and I can pass it around later and show you. But it also is kind of scary too. Well, I mean, I don't know, scary, but also efficient. Also, these are the questions. Is it scary? Or is it good? Do we skip the line? Is that worth it? So the mobile passport control, this app is available for Canadian and American citizens, just Canadian and American citizens at the moment. It was developed by the U.S. CBP, so we can use it. Canadians can use it if they're going through Seattle or going through. There's I think 24 airports that offer this particular application. So in a way, it kind of is like crossing the border on your phone. The border is now kind of coming into our pockets, sort of thing. So in a way, you can think of it that way. It's really interesting to think of how that's kind of encroaching on even on our own bodies, our own persons. We're being bordered before we even reach before we even get in, start the movement, which is really interesting. So that's the end of my presentation, but I wanted to leave with some questions for discussion if you wanted to kind of look at that to spur some conversation or some discussion here, or we could just I could just answer questions that you have if you have any.
Read them.
Yeah. Okay. So first one, do you consider preclearance processes to be aterritorial? And this will just depend on what you think aterritorial means, because it'd be interesting to hear what other people think aterritorial means. Do you consider them to be aterritorial? In my paper and in my research, I have mentioned that they are aterritorial, but I can be swayed, and I think that that's something that we should talk about. And then, so this other quote I have is, bureaucrats operating at the borders are not neutral. On the contrary, over time they have positioned themselves to pursue certain strategies and tactics, to frame the issues and to propose solutions that favor both their bureaucratic imperialism and their organizational culture, in addition to their preferred organizational processes. Do you agree with this? And does this extend to private corporations? So when I wanted to ask this question, I was thinking of private corporations like tour operators. Do they have control over what the government does in terms of these, for example, preclearance? Do they have control over that? Are there, because Tourism Victoria is, hired me to look at the economic gains, and they really want to press that. Do they have any influence over what the government says or does? And that's an interesting question. Next one would be some have argued that the threat of terrorism has created an opening for a Western-led neo-imperial vision of global security constructed on a specific form of freedom for us to be spread abroad. And do you think preclearance is a form of this neo-imperial vision? Why or why not? So I open the floor.